After a 2-day-long conclave, the Cardinals have elected Robert Francis Prevost as the new Pope. He will be known as Leo XIV. But what do we know about him, and what does it mean for the Catholic Church and the world? We'll discuss that on this episode of the BBC's daily news podcast, Newscast. We're joined on a very busy evening by the BBC's religion editor and friend of Newscast, Aleem Maqbool. Hello, Aleem.
Good evening. What a day.
Well, yeah, just take me back to the moment. Like, where were you? What could you see? What was going on when it all happened?
So, look, I was poised on a rooftop, right beside the Vatican. Nobody here really was expecting white smoke at that moment. And it was incredible how a very serene, early evening, beautiful day in Rome just turned into this moment of high drama, this sense that it was a moment of history immediately. With that, I mean, they know how to do drama, I will tell you that. The white smoke comes out, and yes, it was a signal, and it felt like it was a signal that, you know, a new pope had been chosen inside by those cardinals locked away, but really it was a signal for everyone out here to just pour into the square. So the moment it happened, it was extraordinary, but then you saw people filling the place. There were only about 15,000. I say only. There were 45,000 in the square last night for the first smoke signal from the cardinals inside. And this was an early evening vote, and it was only the fourth vote in. And you know, it wasn't expected, given the diversity of the conclave, that this would necessarily end so quickly. So we had 15,000. Very quickly, people were just pouring into the square. There was celebration, there was cheering. The bells of St. Peter's Basilica started pealing. And as I say, a very serene evening turned into something very, very different. I had no idea that they had marching bands around the corner who presumably have been there for every possible moment white smoke had come out of the chimney, because within about 10 minutes they were marching into the square. So we had that going on as well, but we still didn't know who it was. So you have that drama, but then all this anticipation, and the reason people flooded in was because they knew they had a good hour to get here before we'd get the next bit of drama, which was the announcement. So that happens, the crowd fills up, all the streets around here fill up. The television viewers, radio listeners all over the world tune in, and about just over an hour later, you have the man who was always going to come out on the balcony, the protodeacon of the College of Cardinals, steps out, and that's when everyone goes quiet, because he said the magic words in Latin, I announce a joy to the world, we have a pope. But they listen in for who it is, and it is the cardinal's name, but in Latin. And with their first names first in the Latin version of their first names, and then it was Prevost, someone who had been talked about. I'll be completely honest with you, Adam. I didn't know about him a great deal a few weeks back. But because he gives very few interviews, he has given very few interviews, but his name did start coming up after Pope Francis' death, because over the last 2 weeks, you know, we think of the conclave starting, the day they all check in, so yesterday, but really a lot of the conversations have been going on from the moment Pope Francis passed away. But yeah, I mean, that was how it sort of started up until the point we had the announcement of his name. We'll talk a little bit more about why his name came up in a bit, but then they didn't have long to wait, the crowds, before he stepped
we then saw him,
onto the balcony himself. Yeah, he stepped out on the balcony. He took a good couple of minutes to just take it all in, and the chants didn't stop. The cheers didn't stop through that whole couple of minutes. You know, he looked, it's always difficult to say what someone looks like. They looked, some interpreted it as proud, some interpreted it as emotional, But he was certainly taking it all in, and the crowds didn't stop cheering until he started speaking. And the speech was extraordinary. There was a major theme, which was peace. He started with, peace be with you, but he talked about wanting that message to reach everyone wherever they were, to the whole world. He wanted them to hear a message of peace, and then he talked about building bridges, and he returned to that theme of being all one people. And one of the biggest cheers was when he thanked Pope Francis. So these are all indicators. I'm sure we'll talk about what all of that means, but these are all indicators of where his papacy might go. But it was just extraordinary drama, extraordinary theatre over that couple of hours.
And also, it's just that thing of everyone getting used to the idea of the first American Pope, and you sort of expect this kind of with the Chicago accent to come out of his mouth. But of course, no, he still behaves in like a papal way when he's up there on the balcony.
Yeah, sure. I mean, so that's one thing about him. There are those. I had talked to people over the last couple of weeks because I say his name did start coming up because there are a couple of things. I've obviously spoken to a lot of people since Pope Francis' death about what the church needs. I've spoken to cardinals, to others here over the past couple of weeks before they went into conclave about what they thought the person they were looking for was. And a couple of themes came out. One was continuity of what Pope Francis started, which was looking out for the poor, reorientating the church so it wasn't so top-down. It was led by the rank and file people out there, but also, being a voice for the voiceless, reaching out to people in the outer reaches of the Catholic world, but also to other faiths as well. But the other thing, so that was one thing, the theme that kept on coming up, continuity. But the other thing that came up was unity, because there was a sense during the Francis years that because he was a touch of a maverick, he was a touch of a radical, he'd kind of go with it. He'd feel something, he had a vision about reaching out, but he'd go with things, he'd say things, and then we as journalists would be scrabbling around to kind of get clarity about what he meant by that, and what that meant for church teaching, and other cardinals were doing the same. They were scrabbling around. So there was a sense that he went ahead and did things. I wasn't too worried about his critics, even within the church. And so people wanted unity. And Robert Prevost's name started to come through those kind of conversations. That he was someone that, people don't necessarily see as very liberal or very conservative necessarily. There was a case that conservatives could make for him. He was a good sort of managerial figure is how he's seen. But this business about him being American, that there, people will hear that and think, do we need another American in a powerful position in the world? Are there not enough already? But he is seen as, yes, an American, but really a global figure. He is somebody who has, because he spent so long as a missionary in Peru and so much time there, he actually has dual nationality. He's got Peruvian nationality as well. A lot of Latin American cardinals almost see him as one of them. He's a global voice, but he seemed to fit the bill in terms of those themes we were talking about. So, yes, he's also known as being a polyglot. He obviously speaks Spanish fluently, Italian fluently, and so yes, I mean it may have been a surprise to a lot of the world when they were tuning in to see an American take up that role. But for those who knew something about him, it was, what I'd heard about him. I've not spoken to him, seen him around, but I've not spoken to him. But I'd heard he's always got a smile on his face, and I'd heard he was a man of humility. And that's sort of what it appeared like. But, we don't know. People also change as popes. Pope Francis was apparently very dour and serious before he became pope and then opened up. So it still doesn't tell us exactly what kind of pope we're going to get, but that's what we'd heard.
And also the most basic detail of all, he's 69 years old, which in papal terms is quite young. So we could be looking at quite a long Leonine era.
Yes, quite. I mean, there was a feeling, because John Paul II was Pope for a very long time, there was a feeling after that that maybe you didn't want to go for someone too young because you'd be stuck with them for a very long time. And, you know, at the time Pope Francis, for example, was elected in 2013, there was some who raised an eyebrow because some people had sort of ruled him out for being, in his late 70s. But in the end, a sort of 12-year papacy in very crude terms, and a lot of people don't judge it this way, but I heard people talk in these terms, say it was about right. I mean, you don't want to, if, in case it's not someone you can vote out, they stay there until the end of their lives. But the sort of sweet spot was seen as being late 60s, early 70s, as the right man for the job, I suppose. But, we are told that we're not to look at a contest like this in those kind of political terms, that when they go in there, the reason they shut themselves off from the rest of the world, they're literally locked in to the Sistine Chapel, is because they just divorce themselves from all of those kind of thoughts.
Yeah.
And they just go with it. Whatever they feel through prayer, it gives them the kind of freedom to just go with what they feel is the right thing to do. But the fact that they came up with a consensus, or at least 2/3 coalescing around one person within 4 votes, which is relatively short in conclave terms, says that, that feeling may already have been there, that he might be the man for the job.
And Aleem, you've probably not had much time in this chaotic evening to dig into his social media presence, but there's already people saying, did he implicitly criticize the US Vice President, J.D. Vance, when J.D. Vance had said, in religion, in Christianity, there's a sort of hierarchy about who you should care for first, and the rest of the world kind of comes after your family. And also he might have retweeted a post that was critical of Donald Trump. It's hard for you where you are to dig into that, but the Vatican is going to have to address that over the next few days because he's a world historical political figure now.
Yeah, I mean, he was being talked of as a man who wasn't overly political, but on the other hand, he is somebody who, on the kind of global stage, the Pope, of course, is religious leader to 1.4 billion Catholics around the world, but they're a massive global voice, and Pope Francis showed what you can do with that. And if they want continuity, and we think Robert Prevost is going to do this, you take on causes like the dignity of migrants, climate change, poverty, war. Those are the things that Pope Francis did. And so you're going to need to talk to America. And some of the criticism of Pope Francis was that he was talking about these things, but he was talking at America, didn't really understand America. And so, when he's trying, it was seen by some as a bit of a failing of his, because if you want to address all of those issues, you can't do it without being able to speak to America. And Pope Francis did go to Congress, did speak in Congress, but it was never thought that he was a man who could speak to America. On the other hand, you obviously have an American here with a Chicago accent who that accusation can't be leveled at him, obviously. But if you have a history of criticizing the administration, you might have to get over that to achieve some goals. But it didn't really stop Pope Francis. He was very vocal about the issues. So it's in one sense about a balance in saying things straight, but still managing to sort of put a hand on a shoulder and say, look, can we maybe do these things slightly differently?
Aleem, you've got a lot more broadcasting to do, so we really appreciate your time tonight. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Before the news came from the Vatican, the big news was that the US and the UK had signed what do I call this now? I think it's a prosperity pact that has some elements of a trade deal but isn't a full trade deal. And it was accompanied by a big televisual moment between Donald Trump and Keir Starmer on the phone to each other. The person who can unravel it all and link it to what else has been happening in the economical news today is Faisal Islam, who's here. Hello, Faisal.
Hello.
Actually, shall we just reveal a bit how the news sausage is made? So what were you doing when the news about Pope Leo XIV was announced?
I was in the 6 o'clock news studio watching my carefully crafted package.
As they all are.
on which had skillfully weaved together both the story of who was won out of this tariff deal and the interest rate cut and an interview with Andrew Bailey in 2.5 minutes, the Governor of the Bank of England. And 45, like a proud father, 45 seconds of this package had been shown before they just ripped out of it.
Package
went
being
to
the name for a TV report.
And they went to the Vatican.
Which happens very, very rarely, doesn't it?
Rarely.
They yank a piece mid-piece, very rarely.
Mid-sentence, I'll have you.
Right. And what was it like? What was the atmosphere like in the studio at that point?
Oh no, it was an amazing moment of history.
Everyone, yeah.
I mean, I can accept divine intervention. Shall we just say?
But what I was getting at is, like, in those environments, it's actually very calm because people have this image of news being like, panic,
There's
stress,
just an
but it's just not.
astonishing amount of news. I mean, we've talked about Newsfest. I don't know if we can really beat today the white smoke, the deal, the interest rate cut, VE Day.
Yeah.
Who knows what's going to happen in the next 4 hours.
Anyway, right, let's talk about economic news then. Let's focus in on that bit of the news smorgasbord. Actually, do you know what? This announcement of this deal between the US and the UK, that was a bit like the white smoke and the Pope going on the balcony. It was a made-for-TV event, wasn't it?
Yeah, totally.
The unveiling of it.
Yes. And there's a lot to unpack here in terms of what they were trying to achieve, because the bottom line here is the US wanted to use the UK as an example to the rest of the world. This is how to understand this. And that was very clear. And to some degree, Lord Peter Mandelson kind of sort of knew that and has acquiesced in it. And in so doing has created some carve-outs for a critical UK industry. That's the big picture.
Well, let's just talk about the made-for-TV element first, because if you didn't see it, you had Trump sat at the desk in the Oval Office with some of his staff next and his cabinet next to him, but behind his shoulder was Lord Mandelson, the British ambassador. He was on the phone by speakerphone to Keir Starmer, who was at a Jaguar Land Rover facility. Unfortunately, not the one that Downing Street had sent all the journalists to. They got the postcode wrong. And they were having this sort of like old dude awkward chat on the phone, reading their prepared remarks, and it sounded a bit like this.
So to be able to announce this great deal on the same day, 80 years forward, almost at the same hour, and as we were 80 years ago, with the UK and the US standing side by side, I think is incredibly important and makes this truly historic.
I don't know if the media knows, but the US and UK have been working for years to try and make a deal. And it never quite got there.
Yeah.
It did with this prime minister. So
laying it on thick there, the sort of the historical significance of this moment and linking it to like the peak of the transatlantic alliance, which was the Second World War. Yeah. Right. Are we calling this a trade deal? I'm guessing you are not.
I'm not calling it a trade deal because that, for most people, would connote what we were talking about during the Brexit years, which is a comprehensive, full-fat, free trade agreement
with lots of chapters.
Where the tariff rates across thousands of line items of different products and sub-products are all lowered on both sides, and that's carefully negotiated. And we had something like that with India. This is not that. This is really pretty narrow, which is not to downplay its importance where the Prime Minister was at Jaguar Land Rover. It's very specifically targeted. But also, like, the framing of it is different because it starts with America levying significant new tariffs on us unilaterally.
Yeah. On Liberation Day as
and before as well, in terms of the 25% on cars, which is critical to this conversation, and then rowing a small proportion of those back. Again, I'm not trying to downplay this.
Sure.
Just take the cars.
Well, no, let's just run through the numbers then.
Yes,
So,
okay, yeah.
so what has happened to the tariff on cars, which was 25%?
25 plus 2.5. So in total, 27.5 has come down. I mean, so that's just an example of the uncertainty. You're absolutely right to say 25. I've been saying 25. It turns out it was actually 27.5.
Okay. But it's now going to be...
It's now going to be 10% for the first 100,000 cars. And we happen to have exported 101,700 cars last year. So it's not quite all, virtually all the cars would now get that low to 10%. That is highly significant. Car industry source tells me that saves over £1 billion to the UK car industry from what he described as an existential threat to the UK car industry. Hence the Prime Minister saying things like, we've saved thousands and thousands.
And also doing his half of the conference call from Jaguar Land Rover.
Yeah. So it's tick there, but with a caveat, okay? Hang on, what's the counterfactual here? The counterfactual was, if it's January before Trump, the export tariff rate was 2.5%. And unlimited. And you think about Jaguar, famously that pink car that caused so much social media interest, shall we say, that was launched in Miami for export and presumably massive growth into the American market. So literally you can't grow now because it's 100,000. How do you carve that up? Does it count Chinese parts? Loads of details. So it's not, it's
so this is
than we were.
Better than it was last week, but not as good as it was last year.
Yes. So no longer existential, but still painful.
Yeah. And then steel and aluminium, which was at 25%
basically similar sort of thing, but the tariff goes down to 0. And I haven't seen reference to a quota, but some of these details we've still got to shake out.
Because this is the framework of it rather than...
And there was real pain in those industries, particularly for smaller producers of processed metals. So that is also significant.
But Trump's kind of standard tariff of 10%, which he's put on everyone for everything, that still stays for other things for the UK.
For everything else. And on pharmaceuticals, which is our second biggest goods export, where we're expecting a more punitive tariff in the future, the UK will be protected. But yes, 10%, and this is the new news today that is relevant not just for Britain, but for the rest of the world. As regards Britain, that 10%, I think you could argue, and I pushed the Chancellor on this last month, that we're really quite hard done by in terms of that. As acknowledged, actually on many figures, we buy more from the US than they sell to us. So why are they levying reciprocal tariffs on us at all? And then if you put it all together, and again, you compare the situation to where we were in January, Howard Lutnick had an unhelpful chart for the purposes of the UK government. Yeah, he came up after, and he said, and it says so the US tariffs were 3.4%, and they've trebled to 10%. That's the rate. Whereas the UK tariffs were 5.1%, and they've now been cut by 2/3 to 1.8%. That doesn't sound like a great deal for us. It certainly doesn't sound very reciprocal. It sounds like they hit us hard and are like wanting everyone to be thankful for having rode that back a bit. Yeah. So that's where we are. Now, it's important in that comparison to say there are two entirely different lenses on what is a win here. For the Americans, putting the tariff up and getting $6 billion worth of revenue from UK exporters, they see that as a win.
Yeah.
We see that from the UK perspective as the opposite of a win. If they want to do that, you go for your life. We want to lower tariffs because we believe tariffs are a tax on consumers that increase inflation. So in a way, this is a sort of win-win. But I mean, that's a heroic explanation of it.
Yeah.
But you can see that we look at these things. How do you negotiate when you just see things so differently? The presence of Lord Mandelson there.
Well, it just proves where the power is in this dynamic, and it's with the bigger economy.
Well, it is, but if you think that the US is fundamentally damaging itself by raising these tariffs, raising inflation, hitting growth, how do you deal with someone who has the gun?
Yeah,
and it's sort of pointed at you, but it's also pointed at their own toe.
And I suppose that's the economic version of some of the people who will have watched that phone call and thought that Starmer was kind of sucking up to somebody who has not been good to him, i.e. Donald Trump.
Yes, and so I think so if I was to sort of say, well, what's the big diplomatic win? And as I mentioned, Lord Mandelson, who I saw sort of walking around the corridors of power in DC when I was there for the finance ministers' meeting, sort of popping up, and his trump card, as it were, was the was the fact that someone he knows well, Scott Bessent, the US Treasury Secretary, first name terms with him, he went from the outside in the Trump administration. They announced the tariff deals. The bond markets went crazy, and he suddenly became the point man in control of the whole process. And Mandelson knows him well. I mean, is that luck? You make your own luck, and that is what is behind this process. Why he was so prominent. Why we've ended up first. And so for me, the big win is this, from the UK government's perspective, is that they've managed to keep the US sweet, but at the same time create a clear path to a deal with the EU that could be more economically significant and get rid of an awful lot of the red tape that's emerged since Brexit on food and farm export.
Because the UK has not allowed the US to sell things like hormone-treated beef into the UK market. They're only going to allow high-quality kind of beef that we like to come in. So America does get something for its farmers, but not an open door for all sorts of things that we don't want.
Yeah, and you start
Which means that you can then do a deal with the EU about exporting our foodstuffs there, because there's no danger, as the EU would see it, of chlorinated chicken from America coming to the UK and then ending up in the EU.
So you start to, and remember, in the Brexit years, there was this whole thing about the choice, the Chequers deal for Theresa May, all this sort of stuff that you had to basically choose between being close to the European orbit or go into the US orbit, and they have managed to split the difference on this and find a way through it, which I have to say I wouldn't necessarily have thought was possible. I followed this really closely, and they've pulled that off to some degree.
They've threaded the needle, to use that old cliche.
I think they have, and then you start to see the shape of a strategy that they can put to the whole world, which is this is what they say, the most connected economy in the world, amid a tsunami of trade turmoil. A little oasis of trade calm, deals with the US, deal with Europe, deal with India, deal with the Gulf, political stability. You start to see the sell, and it's certainly a rather different picture than the one we had, say, at the turn of the year, recessionary negativity, doom, all this sort of stuff. Rate cut as well today, I should say. You just start to see something different that is quite different to the sort of narrative that we have had about the economy, if they manage to pull this off. Now, I do wonder what the Europeans, say the French, will think. They'll be like, we cannot let these people get away with this.
Well, because also hasn't the UK promised to buy loads of Boeing planes as well?
Well, I mean, I don't know.
Who is it? Great if you want to sell Airbus planes.
But I'm not entirely sure.
Who's doing the buying? Who's doing it doesn't buy Boeing.
Well, I mean, it does a bit in the military, but certainly not the Prime Minister. He's got a plane already. I'm not sure if that promise was made on behalf of British Airways or Ryanair. Let's just...
Or whether it's actually sales that are already happening that were just sort of flagged up as a good thing,
And I'm fascinated, actually, Adam, about what the rest of the world will think about what Britain has done here. Because I guess in a counterfactual world, you might have had Britain saying, we don't accept the premise of your argument. You never should have tariffed us 10%. This whole argument is nonsense. Now, I don't... that's the sort of Love Actually Prime Minister thing that certainly hasn't happened here in this case.
Can I take you back to the ancient time of 2 minutes past midday today?
Oh, yes.
So the Bank of England rate cut that you mentioned was delayed by 2 minutes to be respectful of the 2 minute silence for VE Day. Is it true you had a sort of conclave-style lock-in session at the Bank of England at around about that time?
Not to decide the interest rate.
Not to decide.
Or the governor.
But there is a lock-in.
Oh yeah.
There is a lock-in.
So it's the decision, and it's also a fairly thick document about the new economic forecast that happens every 3 months, and so it's very helpful to read that over a period of an hour and a half. We get a briefing from the bank before we.
And you're locked in, so you can't tell the markets.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So,
not that you would do. But...
So no, we do. We physically can't. We're in the vault. I mean, somewhere near the gold.
Right.
But we, they definitely lock us in, lock us down. No contact with the outside world, and then we rush out. We rush out to our live point to announce excitedly that there's been a rate cut.
But not to extend the conclave metaphor too far. Although why not? There was like a split between the people who actually did vote on the interest rate, the Monetary Policy Committee. It was what, 5-2-2?
Habemus ratus cut. I don't know.
Show off.
My Latin. There was a split, and it was a three-way split. 5 members of the 9-member committee voted for a quarter point cut. That's what happened.
That's what we got, yeah.
2 voted for a jumbo bigger cut, 0.5%. 2 voted for no cut. That's really important. That reflects the total uncertainty in the world economy, and even the total uncertainty about what something like the trade war, not just where the trade war was going, but even if you have the trade war, what is its impact on inflation? We've talked about this before, Adam. So is it going to increase inflation? Generally, we think when tariffs go up and everyone retaliates, inflation will go up. But actually, what we're seeing is 2 factors which are driving inflation down, or rather, the increase is more gentle than we would have expected. So that is the diversion of trade from Asia that would have gone to America, currently empty ships going over the Pacific from China. This is a big story that's brewing. Will be diverted to Europe, potentially the UK. It will lower prices from those sorts of goods. But also, in general terms, the lower growth in the world economy that's been caused by the Trump trade turmoil, frankly, that has lowered energy prices, oil and gas, and that will directly help household bills and lower inflation. So, to be honest, when you did ask me about this sort of 4 months ago, and you said, what's the impact of this trade war? I'd have said, instinctively, inflationary.
Yeah.
But it just shows that it's just
The
a
world
lot
economy is more complicated than that. Yeah.
And interesting.
Yeah, which totally, I would say interesting more than complicated. Faisal, thank you very much.
Great to be here.
And that's all for this episode of Newscast, which has been jam-packed. Thanks for joining us. Bye.